My name is Marcus Rivera, and for 18 years I was a Freemason, a 32nd degree member of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. I stood in the highest echelons of the fraternity, entrusted with secrets that most will never know. I spoke the oaths, performed the rituals, and believed I was part of something noble, something that elevated me above the ordinary struggles of mankind. But 6 months ago, I died on an operating table, and when I came back, everything I thought I knew shattered like glass. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you believe about secret societies, spiritual authority, and the invisible chains we forge with our own words. Because when I stood before Jesus, in that place beyond death, he didn't ask me about my career, my family, or my charitable work. He asked me about my oaths, every single one of them. And what he revealed about those words I spoke in darkened lodge rooms changed me forever. Let me take you back to where it all began, because my journey into Freemasonry didn't start in some mysterious underground chamber. It started in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. I was a corporate attorney, 45 years old, successful by every metric that matters in our world. I specialized in mergers and acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes deals that made or broke companies worth hundreds of millions. My suits were tailored, my car was German, and my reputation was impeccable. I had worked relentlessly to build that life, clawing my way up from a middle-class background in Kansas City to the elite circles of Chicago's legal aristocracy. But success at that level comes with a cost. The higher you climb, the more you realize that skill alone won't take you all the way. It's about connections. It's about who knows your name, who trusts you, who invites you to the private dinners where the real decisions are made. And that's where Freemasonry entered my life. His name was Richard Alderman, senior partner at the firm, a man in his early 60s with silver hair, steady eyes, and the kind of quiet confidence that made boardroom opponents nervous. We'd been working together for 6 months on a particularly complex acquisition. Late nights, intense pressure, the kind of professional crucible that either breaks people apart or bonds them together. We bonded. One evening after we'd finally closed the deal and secured a $30 million victory for our client, Richard invited me to dinner. Not the usual celebratory dinner with the whole team, but something private. Just the two of us. We went to an exclusive steakhouse, the kind of place where senators dined and cameras weren't welcome. Over perfectly aged ribeyes and expensive wine, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus," he said, "you're a damn good attorney. Sharp mind, strong work ethic, impeccable integrity. But I've been watching you and I see something more. I see potential for a different kind of influence. Have you ever considered joining the Freemasons?" I'll admit I was surprised. Freemasons? I'd heard of them, of course, mostly in the context of conspiracy theories and vague historical references. Secret handshakes, mysterious rituals, powerful men meeting behind closed doors. It all seemed a bit archaic, honestly. Something from another century. But Richard wasn't a man prone to archaic nonsense. He was pragmatic, strategic, and deeply connected. If he was a Freemason, and if he was inviting me, then it was worth paying attention. "I don't know much about it," I admitted. "Most people don't," Richard said with a slight smile. "And that's by design. But what I can tell you is this. The fraternity has shaped my life in ways I never expected. It's given me brothers I trust more than blood relatives, principles that guide my decisions, and access to a network that spans the globe. We're not what the conspiracy theorists think we are. We're men seeking to better ourselves and serve our communities. But yes, we do it in a way that requires discretion and commitment." He let that sit for a moment, then leaned forward. "If you're interested, I can arrange for you to visit my lodge. No obligations. Just come, observe, see if it resonates with you." 3 weeks later, I found myself standing outside a stately stone building on the north side of Chicago. It looked like a preserved piece of the early 20th century, ornate architecture, carved pillars, heavy wooden doors with brass fixtures that gleamed under the streetlights. There was no obvious signage, Nothing that screamed Freemason Lodge to the casual passerby. Just an address and a sense of permanence. Richard met me at the door. Inside, the building was even more impressive. Dark wood paneling, marble floors, portraits of stern-looking men in regalia lining the walls. There was a gravity to the place, a sense of tradition and seriousness that I found compelling. This wasn't some modern social club with casual networking events. This was something older, something deliberate. I met several members that night. Doctors, business owners, judges, educators, men of substance and respectability. They spoke about brotherhood, charity, and the pursuit of moral and philosophical growth. They mentioned that Freemasonry had been part of shaping modern Western civilization, that many of the founding fathers had been Masons, that the principles of liberty and enlightenment were woven into the fabric of the fraternity. It appealed to me. Not just the networking potential, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a factor. But more than that, it appealed to something deeper, a desire for meaning beyond the courtroom, a sense of belonging to something greater than myself. A structured path toward becoming a better man. I petitioned to join, and 6 months later, I was initiated as an entered apprentice, the first degree of Freemasonry. I'll never forget that night. The initiation ceremony was unlike anything I'd experienced. I was blindfolded, my jacket removed, one pant leg rolled up, one shoe removed, a rope tied loosely around my neck. I was led into the lodge room in that vulnerable state, unable to see, acutely aware of my own discomfort and uncertainty. Then came the questions. Formal, ritualistic questions about my intentions, my willingness to keep secrets, my belief in a higher power. I answered as instructed. And then came the oath. I was guided to kneel before the altar, my hand placed on the Holy Bible, the square, and the compass. And I swore an oath. Not just any oath, but a binding, solemn vow of secrecy. I promised never to reveal the signs, tokens, or words of a master mason, under penalty of having my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by its roots, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea. The language was archaic and symbolic, I was told. Theatrical remnants of medieval tradition, not meant to be taken literally. But the weight of those words felt real. The gravity in the room felt real, and when the blindfold finally came off and I saw my brothers standing around me in their regalia, solemn and watchful, I knew I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just Marcus Rivera, attorney. I was now a Freemason. I belonged to something ancient, something secret, something powerful, and I felt incredible. The sense of belonging was immediate. These men, some of whom I'd just met, treated me as a brother. They shared wisdom, offered mentorship, welcomed me into a tradition that stretched back centuries. There were dinners, ceremonies, philosophical discussions. I started attending regularly, eager to learn, eager to advance. And advance I did, rapidly. Within 2 years, I'd progressed through the 3 foundational degrees, entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. Each degree came with its own ceremony, its own teachings, its own oaths. Each oath built upon the last, adding layers of obligation and secrecy. With each degree, I felt myself growing, not just in knowledge, but in status. Other attorneys in the city who were Masons began to acknowledge me differently. I was invited to private gatherings, introduced to influential people, recommended for lucrative cases. My career flourished in ways that felt almost miraculous. Doors opened that had been previously closed. I told myself it was because I was becoming a better man, more disciplined, more principled, more connected to timeless truths. And maybe, on some level, that was part of it. But there was also a transaction happening that I didn't fully acknowledge. I was gaining access to power and influence because I had proven I could keep secrets. Because I had sworn oaths that bound me to a brotherhood that valued loyalty above all else. And I wanted more. So I joined the Scottish Rite, an appendant body of Freemasonry that offers additional degrees beyond the first 3. If the Blue Lodge degrees were foundational, the Scottish Rite degrees were advanced philosophy, complex allegories exploring morality, justice, and the nature of divinity. There were 33 degrees in total, though only 32 were conferred through ritual. The 33rd was honorary, bestowed by invitation only upon those who had demonstrated exceptional service to the fraternity. Over the next decade and a half I climbed, degree by degree, oath by oath. Each ceremony was more elaborate than the last, filled with symbolism drawn from ancient traditions, from the Knights Templar to the builders of Solomon's Temple. I spoke more oaths. I learned more secrets. I received more regalia, more titles, more recognition. And with every step, I felt the weight of it settling onto my shoulders. Not a burden exactly, but a density. A sense of being woven into something vast and intricate, a network of obligations and loyalties that extended far beyond my understanding. By the time I reached the 32nd degree, the master of the royal secret, I was deeply embedded in the fraternity. I held leadership roles in my lodge. I mentored newer members. I participated in charitable work, fundraising for hospitals and scholarships. On paper, I was living the Masonic ideal, a man of integrity, service, and enlightenment. But something was wrong. I couldn't name it at first. It was subtle, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. A growing sense of emptiness that didn't match the external success. My career was thriving. My standing in the fraternity was high. But inside, I felt hollow. My wife noticed. Sarah had been patient for years, supportive of my involvement in Freemasonry, even when it took me away from home for meetings and ceremonies. But as time went on, I could see the distance growing between us. She'd ask about my evenings at the lodge and I'd deflect. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I couldn't fully share. The oaths forbade it. The secrecy was absolute. My kids noticed too. I'd miss dinners, miss soccer games, because I had obligations to the lodge. I told myself it was for their benefit, that my success and my connections would give them a better life. But I could see the question in their eyes. Why was I always somewhere else? And deeper than that, beneath the surface of my daily life, there was a spiritual emptiness I couldn't shake. I prayed occasionally, in a vague, cultural kind of way. I believed in God, sure. The Freemasons required belief in a supreme being, after all. But my relationship with God felt transactional, distant. I had sworn oaths invoking his name, but I didn't truly know him. I felt like a man standing in a vast library filled with books about wisdom, but never actually reading any of them. I had climbed the ladder. I had earned the titles. I had spoken the sacred words. But I didn't feel saved. I didn't feel free. I felt bound. And then, on a cold Tuesday morning in late September, everything changed. I was at the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine surgery. Nothing serious, just a minor procedure to address some persistent back pain from years of sitting hunched over legal documents. The doctors assured me it was low risk, straightforward. I'd be home by evening. I remember being wheeled into the operating room. The bright lights overhead, the cool air, the calm professionalism of the surgical team. I remember the anesthesiologist telling me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7, and then I was gone, but not in the way I expected. At first there was nothing, just darkness and silence. And then suddenly I was aware, not of my body, but of myself. I was floating above the operating table, looking down at my own body. I could see the surgeons working frantically, their movements urgent. I could see the monitors displaying erratic lines. I could hear the muffled shouts, the controlled panic. And I realized, with a clarity that cut through everything else, I was dying. There was no pain, no fear, not in that moment. Just a strange, detached awareness. I watched them try to revive me, watched my chest compress under their hands, watched the defibrillator pads pressed against my skin. And I thought with an odd sense of curiosity, is this it? Is this how it ends? Then the darkness shifted. I was no longer in the operating room. I was somewhere else, somewhere I can't fully describe because human language doesn't have the vocabulary for it. It wasn't a place exactly. It was more like a space between spaces, a threshold. And I wasn't alone. There was light, not harsh but overwhelming in its intensity. Not painful, but impossible to look away from. And within that light, a presence, a being. Someone I knew with every fiber of my being, even though I'd never met him before. Jesus. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at me. And his eyes, I can't explain this properly, but his eyes contained everything. Love, yes. but also sorrow and authority, and truth so absolute that it made every lie I'd ever told, every compromise I'd ever made, stand out in sharp relief. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask where I was, what was happening, if I could go back. But the words caught in my throat, because I knew somehow that he already knew everything, every thought, every deed, every secret I'd ever kept. And then he spoke. His voice was gentle, but it filled everything. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. "Marcus," he said, "do you know what you have done?" I didn't understand the question. I thought he meant my life, my sins, the usual moral inventory. But he continued, and what he said next shattered everything. "Do you remember the oaths you swore?" And in an instant I did. Every single one, every word I had spoken in those lodge rooms, every binding vow I had made. They played out before me like a film, vivid and undeniable. The oaths of the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, the master mason. The oaths of the Scottish Rite degrees, each one more complex than the last. Oaths invoking God's name. Oaths binding me to secrecy under penalty of death. Oaths of loyalty to the fraternity above all else. And for the first time I saw them for what they really were. Not noble commitments, not symbolic traditions. Chains. The light was so intense I couldn't look directly at him, but I felt his presence with every fiber of my being. And then he spoke again, and the first words shattered everything I thought I knew about the oaths I had sworn. His voice wasn't angry. It was tender, but it cut through me like a sword. "Marcus," he said, "do you know what you have bound yourself to?" I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but no words came out. Fear gripped me. Not the fear of punishment, but the fear of finally understanding. The fear that everything I'd defended, everything I'd justified for 18 years, was about to be revealed for what it truly was. Jesus extended his hand toward me, and suddenly I wasn't just standing there anymore. I was seeing. Visions flashed before my eyes, images of my initiation ceremonies, the oaths I'd sworn, the penalties I'd agreed to. But now, they weren't just symbolic rituals. They were alive, dark, binding. "You swore allegiance to the great architect," Jesus said, his eyes never leaving mine. "But you didn't know his true name, did you?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that it was just tradition, just brotherhood, just a way to connect with successful men. But the words died in my throat, because in that moment I knew. I finally knew. Jesus turned slightly, and the scene around us shifted. I saw myself, kneeling in that lodge room years ago, my hand on the Bible and the square and compass. I heard my own voice taking the oath, binding myself under no less a penalty than having my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by its roots. I had told myself it was symbolic. Everyone said it was symbolic. But Jesus looked at me with those eyes full of both love and sorrow, and he said, "Marcus, these oaths created spiritual barriers between you and me. Every time you called upon my name in that lodge, every time you prayed to me as a Christian while bound to another master, those oaths stood in the way. They were walls you built yourself, brick by brick, oath by oath." And my legs gave out. I fell to my knees, but somehow I wasn't falling. I was suspended in his presence, held by something I couldn't see. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I didn't know." "But now you do," he said gently. "And that's why you're here." Then the vision shifted again, and I saw something that shattered me completely. I saw other men, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps. Men I knew from the lodge, men I'd mentored, men I'd brought in. They were all bound. Invisible chains wrapped around their hearts, their minds, their spirits. They were praying, calling out to God, but their prayers were hitting a ceiling they couldn't see. The oaths they'd taken were like barriers, blocking the fullness of God's presence. "They don't know," I gasped. "They're just like I was. They think it's compatible. They think they can serve two masters." Jesus nodded slowly. "And many will never know, Marcus. They will go to their graves believing they were free, never realizing what they gave away when they swore those oaths." The weight of it crushed me. I thought of my brothers in the lodge, good men, charitable men, men who loved their families, who gave to their communities, but men who were bound by something they couldn't see, something they'd invited in through solemn oaths and sacred promises. These aren't just words, are they? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The penalty clauses, the blood oaths, they're not symbolic. Jesus' expression grew even more serious. They are contracts with powers of darkness, Marcus. Every word spoken in oath, every penalty agreed to, every gesture made in those secret rooms. They give legal right to spiritual forces that want nothing more than to keep my children from knowing me fully. You didn't swear those oaths to me, you swore them to another. The truth hit me like a physical blow. 18 years, 32nd degree. I'd climbed so high in the organization, believing I was ascending to enlightenment. But all along, I was binding myself tighter and tighter to something that stood in opposition to the very Christ I claimed to serve on Sundays. I broke, completely, utterly broke. Sobs racked my body, not because I feared hell in that moment, but because I saw clearly for the first time. I saw the deception. I saw the trap. I saw what I had done to myself and to others. Forgive me, I cried out. Jesus, forgive me. I renounce it, all of it. Every oath, every degree, every allegiance. I renounce the penalties, the secrets, the false worship. I renounce the great architect that isn't you. I renounce the entire system. The words poured out of me like a confession that had been building for years. I named every degree, every oath, every ritual. I confessed it all, holding nothing back. And as I spoke, something happened. I felt it, physically felt it. Like chains I hadn't known were there suddenly snapped. Like weights I'd been carrying for 18 years fell away. I gasped, my hands instinctively reaching for my chest, my throat, expecting to find something tangible, but there was nothing physical. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that something had broken. Jesus smiled, and it was the smile of a father watching his child take their first free steps. The bonds are broken, Marcus, he said. The oaths have no power over you anymore. I paid the price for your freedom, and now you've chosen to receive it. Then I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them glowing or changed somehow, but they looked the same. Yet everything was different. I felt lighter, clearer, free in a way I'd never experienced. Then Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and his expression shifted to one of solemn purpose. Now, Marcus, you have a choice. You can return to your life and pretend this never happened. You can keep silent about what you know, or you can return and tell them the truth. Tell them, I asked, my voice still shaky. Many are bound and don't know it, he said, his voice carrying the weight of infinite compassion. They sit in pews on Sunday, believing they're free, but Monday through Saturday they bow to another master. They need someone who has walked the path to show them the way out, someone who knows the cost of those oaths, someone who has experienced the freedom of renouncing them. I knew what he was asking. I knew what it would cost. My reputation, my professional network, friendships spanning decades, the respect of men I admired. Everything I'd built in the legal world was connected to those lodge relationships. But I also knew I had no choice. Not really. How could I stay silent when I'd seen what I'd seen? How could I let my brothers remain in chains when I knew the key to their freedom? I'll tell them, I said, and as the words left my mouth, I felt something settle in my spirit. A mission, a purpose, a calling I'd never expected. Jesus nodded, his eyes full of approval and something that looked like pride. Then it's time to go back, Marcus. Time to live the life I've called you to. Time to be truly free. And just like that, I was pulled away. The presence of Jesus faded, the light dimmed, and I felt myself being drawn backward through darkness, through space, through what felt like layers of reality. My eyes snapped open, fluorescent lights, beeping machines, the sterile smell of hospital antiseptic. Pain rushed back into my body, centered in my chest. I gasped, my lungs burning as they filled with air. He's back! He's back! A nurse's voice, sharp with surprise and relief. A doctor leaned over me, shining a light in my eyes. Mr. Rivera? Can you hear me? You're in the hospital. You've had a cardiac event. But I wasn't thinking about my heart. I was thinking about the chains that had just broken, about the brothers who were still bound. about the mission Jesus had given me. I spent 2 weeks in that hospital, and in those 2 weeks, everything changed. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, what I'd learned, what I'd been commissioned to do. My wife visited, confused by the change in me. Next hit. My law partners came by, concerned about when I'd return to work. My lodge brothers sent flowers and cards, completely unaware that I would never set foot in another meeting. The day I was discharged, I made 3 decisions. First, I drafted my resignation letter to the lodge, explaining clearly and completely why I could no longer participate. Second, I began the process of restructuring my law practice to end the partnerships that were built on lodge connections. Third, I started writing down everything I'd experienced, everything I'd learned, everything Jesus had shown me. The reaction was swift and brutal. Friends of 18 years stopped speaking to me. Professional opportunities vanished overnight. I was called a traitor, a religious fanatic, a man who'd lost his mind during his near-death experience. The legal community that had once embraced me now whispered about me in hallways and closed doors in my face. But I was free. For the first time in 18 years, I was truly free. And I knew that every door that closed, every friendship that ended, every opportunity that vanished, it was all worth it for the freedom I'd found. Now listen to me carefully, because this is why I'm telling you this story. If you're watching this right now, and you're a Freemason, or your father was, or your grandfather was, you need to understand something. Those oaths you took, or that were taken in your family line, they're not just symbolic traditions. They're spiritual contracts, and they create barriers between you and the fullness of God's presence. I stood before Jesus. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw men bound by oaths they thought were meaningless. I saw prayers blocked by barriers they didn't know existed. And I was shown the way out. You can be free. Right now, in this moment, you can break those chains. It doesn't matter if you're a 3rd degree or a 33rd degree. It doesn't matter if you've been in for 3 months or 30 years. Jesus can break those bonds the moment you renounce them. I'm going to pray a prayer of renunciation, and if you're ready, if you're willing to be free, I want you to pray this with me. Out loud, in your room, in your car, wherever you are. Speak these words. Jesus, I come before you right now, and I renounce every oath I have taken in Freemasonry. I renounce every degree, every obligation, every penalty I agreed to. I renounce all allegiance to any being or power that is not you. I declare that you alone are my Lord and Master. I ask you to break every spiritual chain, every barrier these oaths created between us. By your blood and your authority, I claim my freedom. I receive your forgiveness and your complete restoration. Thank you for setting me free. In Jesus' name, amen. If you prayed that prayer, you've just taken the first step toward true freedom. The journey won't be easy. There may be consequences. There may be relationships that change. But I promise you, on the authority of what I've seen and experienced, freedom in Christ is worth any cost. My life today looks nothing like it did before that night I died. I left my law firm. I now spend my time helping others find freedom from spiritual bondage. I travel, I speak, I meet with men and women who are realizing that the organizations they joined, the oaths they took, the allegiances they swore, they all came with a price they didn't understand. And every time I see someone renounce those oaths and experience that moment when the chains break, when the weights fall away, when they feel for the first time in years the unhindered presence of God, I remember standing before Jesus. I remember what he told me, return and tell them the truth. So that's what I'm doing. That's what I'll keep doing until my last breath. Because the enemy wants you to believe those oaths are just tradition, just ceremony, just symbols with no real power. But I stood before Jesus and he told me the truth. Those oaths are real. The bondage is real. But the freedom he offers is even more real. And it's available to you right now if you're willing to choose it. Choose freedom. Choose truth. Choose Jesus.